Well, welcome everyone to our next iteration of our podcast here. We've got Zach, we've got me, Lindsey, with Naraxon. I figured I'd open up this podcast just to tell a quick fun fact about running. Running biomechanics, that is. So, did you know that elite runners tend to have lower vertical oscillation compared to recreational runners? So, this means that elite runners bounce less and spend more energy propelling themselves forward versus going up and down. So, that is sort of an efficiency thing that helps reduce energy loss and allows them to run faster and more economically over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'd be lying to you if I said that I knew that. But it makes a lot of sense. And I know that in the past, actually, because, there's several demo records of me running on a treadmill. And for sure, somebody has told me at one point in time that, like, I have too much vertical oscillation when I run. And then I started thinking about it, even while just running, around the park or whatever. And then I don't know how to change that though. Like, what do you do? What do you change? How do you change your form to reduce the oscillation? Is maybe the question that I have about that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
will I turn into an elite runner if I stop doing that?
Maybe, because
Maybe we're close.
Supposedly that is a key difference
I
between
guess so.
recreational and elite
Yeah.
runners. So maybe if you're able to eliminate that, you push yourself into the elite category.
I guess so. We'll have to try it out. We'll have to find somebody that knows what they're talking about and see if they can give me some cues to work on.
I know,
and
man.
keep
Me
doing
too.
some testing.
I keep waiting for someone to come in here and fix my running form one day.
Yeah, you gotta keep working at that one. I'm excited to dive into that a little bit because you've got a little bit of a unique running form, and you've had some experiences with injuries and things like that. Yet you also competed, in triathlete or triathlons as a triathlete, and so how did you kind of navigate that? You knew that you had, maybe you didn't know at the time that you had this kind of interesting contact pattern, but maybe it explains a little bit more these days as far as like why you had some of that foot pain or issues.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much of that contact pattern existed before I got injured.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Because it was the age-old, like, 18-year-old who thinks that injury isn't coming for her, and I had a stress fracture, but just kept running on it for a few months and just developed these different gait patterns to avoid those areas of pain.
Yeah.
And just never learned out of it, basically. Just like couldn't figure out how to get back to normal. So.
And now it's just how it goes for you, right?
Now it's how it goes.
Yeah.
Now I don't run long distances anymore. I won't say that I will never run long distances again, but I have promised myself that I would fix that strange running form before I try to get back into it.
Long distance.
Yeah, I guess we'll see.
I guess we both have a couple things to work on then.
Yeah.
To become elite runners.
I know.
But I guess to introduce the topic of the conversation today, we want to talk about sports science myths. And so, one of them is the myth of the perfect running form. And I think this is probably a controversial statement to make that, or if you were to say that there is a perfect running form, I think that everyone could agree that that's probably not the case, just considering the variability from person to person. And you kind of have to tune, their running form to how their body is shaped and their size and really what their goals are too, right?
Yeah, I fully agree.
We know that a long distance runner versus a sprinter is going to have different form, right? And so then you take also the elite level runners versus your weekend warriors or kind of casual runners, and what are the goals there? But I thought that was an interesting topic to start on, just because we do have a lot of experience working with people that are using our equipment to measure this stuff, right? And oftentimes they are kind of doing this like I would say like these N of 1 studies, right? Like they baseline somebody, they figure out kind of what their mechanics are at the time. they go over with them like what's their goals, right? Maybe it's to reduce pain, maybe it's to gain efficiency, maybe it's to be faster or whatever it is, right? And then they tailor that to them. And I don't know, maybe there's some kind of general areas that you can guide someone towards as far as
Yeah.
like cadence, or if you see somebody and they're really overstriding, right, like that's a clear indication that like, okay, you don't necessarily know how to run properly. But that isn't to say that there's like this perfect running form that if you can hit it, then you're going to be the best runner ever.
Right. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit too, just
Yeah.
to kind of add to this conversation. I agree that there is no one perfect running form, and
Yeah.
arguably the job of these clinicians out there that, help athletes or weekend warriors, whoever you are, find this, best running form,
Mm-hmm.
are tailoring their, practice to that runner based on their anthropometry, how they move, their strengths, how fast they're running, etc. But I mean, looking into it, there are several common things about running form or running in general that pretty much, I won't say everyone, because I don't know about everyone, but a lot of people agree that like those things are imperative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like this vertical oscillation, like oscillating less up and down so that you reduce that energy leak. Having a little bit of lean forward
Mm-hmm.
as you're running. Most
Yep.
people agree that that's necessary too. Reducing impact forces, and all three of those things kind of play into each other hand in hand,
Yeah.
don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're oscillating less, you're reducing those impact forces. You might also be leaning forward a little bit more to try to transfer that energy forward rather than up and down.
Mm-hmm.
And the cool thing is we can measure all of that stuff
Right.
and try to find those patterns between all these things. But
yeah, because sometimes it's not like immediately apparent just by looking at it, right?
yeah, exactly.
Or it's so subtle in some cases that, yeah, maybe with the trained eye could see it, but it's hard for the person who's maybe making those adjustments to really understand that they've changed something.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you, so I mean, I guess in your experience coming out of injury, and you said that you don't really run long distance anymore, but do you do some cardio like that? Like, do you still run at all? Maybe for like a mile or something like that, like on a
Yeah, like a
treadmill.
mile here and
Yeah.
there.
Have you tried to incorporate any sort of fixes into your mechanics while doing that, or is it just like, hey, I'm in the gym, I'm just trying to get this workout done, and
Oh my
we'll worry
gosh.
about fixing things later on.
Yeah, I have tried. Honestly, I've been trying to see if I can figure out some kind of schedule where I can like come in here and do like the
Do some
pressure
training, yeah.
analysis and then like go like try fixing it myself for a couple weeks, come back, see if it's really changed. But I just haven't been consistent enough with it. Running isn't really a big part of the exercise routine I currently have.
Sure.
So it's just kind of like on the back burner right
Yeah.
now, so to speak. But
Yeah.
it's really easy to learn a lot from the people that we work with in this industry,
Sure.
especially the clinicians working with our technology. And so you kind of learn a little bit here and there about like, okay, this person thinks that this type of thing is ideal, or this running form is ideal, or it would be ideal to have this specific muscle activation pattern. And so, but the gap is still like, well, I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah.
Like maybe this is ideal, but how do I make that happen, right?
Yeah.
What are the cues?
That's a good point, and I mean, I think that's probably one of the hardest things for people to actually adopt is like, if you really have to change your like running mechanics, like you can't just tell somebody to start run like, hey, run with more of a forefoot strike,
Yeah.
like that doesn't, maybe they can do it like in that moment, but there's no way that there's any sort of lasting effect, right? Like it has to be a training program. Like you have to go through this series of steps in order for that to become more of an intrinsic experience than like reacting to biofeedback even.
Exactly.
But and I it's interesting too because being in this industry and seeing kind of the different people that use our equipment or use the similar types of equipment for, either research or actual, running training, I kind of like developed my own, I would say, like format of the ideal running form based off of what I was sort of gathering from the research that I would see, right?
Yeah.
And that incorporated things like the most basic one was always like a cadence change. So being able to measure that and see, okay, do I fall within that realm? And this again is for like more, let's call it like endurance running, not sprinting, right? Because that's different. And then the strike pattern, that one was always interesting to me because I personally didn't have an issue with that, like where I was overstriding and really hitting hard on my heel. But you see that represented by other people, and then you can understand why they might have low back pain or knee pain or something like that, right? So that's one too. But usually, like the cadence manipulation tends to have an effect on that as well.
Right.
One thing though that like I personally really tried to do was make it more of a forefoot striking pattern. Kind of going back to like the initial part of the conversation, like understanding that I was oscillating a lot vertically. It just made sense to me, like, oh, okay, well, what if I like just lean forward more, right? Or like go more onto my toes? Like, will that just automatically force me to go forward as opposed to up?
Did it?
I don't know. I got to check. But I will say otherwise, what happened was I definitely adopted more of that forefoot pattern. I got like barefoot shoes, right? So that was another aspect that it's really difficult to run with like a midfoot strike in barefoot shoes because it doesn't.
Oh my gosh, you don't want to.
It doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel right. Yeah.
And so I would do that. I can't say that I gained any sort of like speed or anything like that. But for sure, what happened was I would get really sore calves, and I would get
makes sense.
Really sore shins too.
Did
right?
The shoes that you got, were they like zero drop or something? Yeah.
Yeah, it was just like as flimsy as it gets, right? And they're great, and I kind of fell into that style, but for sure after I would be done, I'd be like, man, like I am sore,
Yeah.
because I wasn't doing any of the other pieces to help with that, right? Like I wasn't doing anything to improve my ankle range of motion. I wasn't doing anything to improve my strength of my, my calves or my tibialis.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I was just saying like, oh, maybe if I just inject this one piece, then I'll have like a different experience without actually going through the full training load of it.
Yeah.
And now since I've actually kind of taken a step back and been like, okay, well, maybe that's not really the right mechanics for me personally.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel great. Like I don't feel like I'm any better of a runner. And afterwards, I kind of have these like issues that I have to deal with. But if I just sort of fall back to more of a natural contact pattern, it's much more of a midfoot.
Yeah.
I definitely can't wear those barefoot shoes when doing that.
Okay.
And so that has actually kind of been something that I've been trying to work with a little bit, but I need to get new shoes is what I need.
So this is interesting. The other thing that I've seen from a lot of people is that you train things like cadence and trunk lean and vertical oscillation, but most of the time, and again, not everyone, right? I don't know everyone's ideology, but most of the time it seems like people aren't trying to change the contact pattern. They're trying to change these other things, and if the contact pattern, whether you're heel striking or forefoot or midfoot, changes as an effect of that, cool, but maybe not necessary.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting, and that's, I mean, just for everyone out there, that's my main problem as a runner is like I'm a forefoot runner on one side and a heel striker on the other, like it's all screwed up. So it feels like I do need to change that contact pattern, but
for the sake of symmetry, maybe that means something, but
exactly. But like if I train these other things, do those change as an effect, or do I have to put in some extra effort to like contact on the parts of my foot that like previously I was kind of afraid to because there was pain,
Right.
So
yeah, that's interesting. I think it definitely comes down to like what's the biggest bang for your buck,
Yeah.
and especially when you're talking to clinicians or people that are coaching this stuff, right? They get to see their clients and you only see them so often. And, typically it's like in between certain events. So maybe they're preparing for a race or, they have a certain goal in mind that they want to meet, within this 3-month period or whatever it is, right? Or a couple weeks even. And so I think to sort of really adopt like a whole new mechanical pattern, right, is so involved.
Yeah.
And so it maybe doesn't make as much sense. Whereas doing the other stuff, training cadence, even, I guess you could look at things like, maybe overstriding as like a change in the contact pattern. But
yeah, maybe
in a sense, like I feel like that's one of those things that you just get like the biggest effect with the least amount of effort, let's say.
Yes.
And so it's kind of like, hey, let's reset this baseline really quick with this cue, and then we'll work from there.
Yeah. The cues are everything for a lot of people, right? Like a lot of times you'll tell someone one cue and it won't work at all for them. But if you tell that same cue to someone else, that clicks,
Yep.
So, and honestly, just to introduce some of the other topics we'll be talking about today as well, I think that's going to be a common theme that'll keep coming up, honestly, is just like, if humans are like these pattern machines, right? Like if you just do the same thing over and over again, you figure out what clicks for you. Like, is that better than doing it ideally,
I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I guess we'll see.
So as far as these other topics, we can keep going down the list, but we have a few of these myths that I guess we can talk about. I won't say that we're going to go as far as debunking them because
we're not the mythbusters.
We're not.
Here.
No, not yet. Maybe one day we can take on those personas, but I think that we each have our own experiences, as athletes, maybe with a former in parentheses before that word, but and of course working here and kind of listening to people that use our equipment and anecdotes that they give us, and so plus all the just random content that we sort of absorb as part of our job duties in this industry. So we've touched on running form. It seems as though that we're in agreement that there is no ideal necessarily. There might be, like if you mathed it out, there's an ideal, right? Like how do you...
Someone's going to make an AI that says this is the perfect running form, but I'm just so skeptical because everyone has completely different anthropometry and like there's not one right way to do something, and there's other things like activation patterns that affect it too. Like if you wanted to have a certain amount of hip flexion, cool, but what if you have weaker hip flexors than that other guy who's able to achieve that?
Right.
So, anyway.
I did come across an interesting study it's titled Injury and Performance Related Biomechanical Differences Between Recreational and Collegiate Runners.
Okay.
Which, you can kind of break these people into, and this is by Evans, out of, let's see here, Western University in London, Ontario, Canada.
Okay.
But anyways, you could kind of break this up, I guess, into sort of like this elite running group, right? These collegiate runners, obviously, they're at university to perform the sport versus, somebody who's just doing it recreationally. But interestingly, what they had found was that the collegiate runners had a greater ankle joint contribution. And so they are positing that maybe that makes them more efficient and allows them to have a greater capacity to increase speed. So because typically somebody who's running at a collegiate level is going to be pretty fast, versus
totally.
Recreation. And so they did, the motion capture, they looked at the kinetics as well. And that was one of the things that sort of stood out, was that the collegiate runners were using that ankle joint more than the recreational runners, which I thought that was interesting. So it's kind of like, and I think that goes to talking about even some of the things that I was mentioning earlier for myself was like, you have higher range of motion or mobility at the ankle. You've got stronger muscles that, you know, contribute to the control of that joint as well. And then, you know, how does that play? What role does that play kind of going up the chain too?
Yeah, totally.
Can you take stress off the knee because you're able to produce more of that propulsive moment with the ankle?
Yeah. And I mean, that's a big topic too, right? A lot of people think that whatever is going on at the knee is an effect of something that might be happening proximally at the hip or distally at the ankle as well. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And that reminds me, I read this book, it was a long time ago, it's called Born to Run. And there was this whole chapter about how humans are designed to be endurance runners because the Achilles tendon basically acts as this spring, essentially. And we're like the only mammals that have this, or maybe not. I'm probably misremembering some things in the book, right? But like basically the Achilles tendon is just acting like this spring where you're continually loading it and unloading it. It's helping propel you forward rather than like, you know, you getting tired, right? So that makes a lot of sense that this ankle range of motion and ankle mobility and just like better use of that ankle joint in general has a big effect, on the running biomechanics.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe there's not an ideal running form that everybody should meet, but there's definitely these like barriers that you can put on people that sort of put them into maybe the better category or faster category, whatever that is. But certainly it comes down to what are your goals, you know, what are your current issues that you might be having, pain or otherwise, and kind of meet you where you're at today and then see if you can progress from there. But it even seems like getting anybody to kind of fit that perfect mold would be such a tall task in general that you'd probably create some problems along the way.
Exactly. That's what I always think about it too, is like you'll never find me making these black and white statements about anything movement related, because it's like if you just haven't been doing that at all, is that really the best thing to start doing today?
Yeah, which I think is a perfect segue into our next myth, which is stretching before exercise. Does it really prevent injuries, or is it just a waste of time?
I don't know, man. There's the research on this is all over the place.
Okay.
And man, I was looking at a few different articles in preparation for this, and basically the consensus is like, we don't know. You know, like some research suggests that stretching before exercise can be detrimental. Some suggest that stretching statically after exercise is okay, but dynamic stretching should be used before exercise.
Right.
And I mean, flexibility is important.
Right.
I think we can agree on that.
I hope so, yeah.
I hope so. I think flexibility is important. So if you're stiffer, like you're not able to achieve the range of motion you need to for certain activities to be better, right? Let's say you're trying to do like a squat. If you don't do any sort of range of motion stretching at all or dynamic stretching, like you're maybe not able to get into the right position.
Yeah.
But does it really reduce injuries?
I don't know. Yeah, I agree. I think that the jury's still out on that one. As far as injury reduction, I think there's definite clear benefits of stretching statically, dynamically to some effect of mobility, right? I think what's interesting is seeing how like it's changed, particularly again coming from like an anecdotal personal experience, where you know as a kid, and you would you know whether it be for PE or you know for sports, right? Whatever, playing soccer or basketball or something, you know you'd stand around in your circle or something, and everyone's like doing toe touches.
Yeah, or, everyone's doing like the arm circles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just for the most part, like very static stretches.
Yeah.
And then as you know, I got older and continued playing sports into college, it totally transformed, and it was like you know before competition was dynamic warm up, And so, that encompassed everything from these sort of like dynamic stretches to, different levels of intense, like warm up activities, sprints and things like
Yeah.
that. And then after competition or after practice, then yeah, you break down, you sort of cool down with this kind of like static stretch. Um, and so that's sort of where my frame has been developed, I guess. But now working at Neuraxon and kind of again having more of these experiences, seeing what like the experts are actually doing, it's interesting to see how, as far as dynamic stretching in and of by itself is not actually, doesn't seem to be as effective when you're talking about like pre-competition. Now it's
Yeah.
like, okay, you got to do these like activation exercises, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that's just priming the system to be able to work at its most optimal level. And I think that's really what you're trying to achieve with this like pre-activity warm up, is just get things going, right? And
Yeah.
like make sure you have the connections where you need to have the connections, get that, dynamic range of motion that you want. But I can't say, and I don't think anyone would say that like that's actually preventing an injury from happening.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Maybe someone will listen to this and be like, "Hey,
I
here's my paper."
I want someone to prove us wrong.
I know,
please,
right?
please email us.
Yeah.
Please call us. Please say we're wrong. I want someone to have a conversation about. But I'm glad you told this story in the way you kind of laid it out, where it's like, as a kid, it's more about like static stretching, and then it started becoming more about dynamic stretching, and then it's not even about stretching at all. It's about these warm-ups.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in my mind, I'm thinking like maybe that's where this myth started, is like, okay, people started suggesting stretching because people thought it was a good idea to feel the muscles that were about to be worked.
Sure.
But maybe not by stretching them is kind of where we've gone from there, right? Like maybe by activating them to some degree. And but yeah, I mean, the jury's out there, but that's my theory, is that like people have always wanted to feel the muscle before doing the work that they're about to do, the activity they're about to do, but maybe stretching was sort of the like misguided first idea at how to do that.
Well, it's kind of funny, right? Because it's like if you take static stretching and these like activation exercises, they're literally opposites, right? Like
I know.
one you're lengthening the muscle and the other one you're shortening the muscle. So it's funny how that's completely done a 180.
Yeah.
But I think most people would probably agree that like a static stretch is maybe reserved for after, in a cool down scenario, or of course if you're doing like yoga or something, right, where like that's the entire point of the activity.
But stretching is still good. I mean,
like you said, I mean mobility, right? Like if you don't have mobility, then you're probably not moving very well.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at all.
Yeah.
Another sort of anecdote, again, like personal experience, just to sort of play on this a little bit, but personally, like pre-competition, as a washed-up college lacrosse player that still pretends like he can go out and compete.
You teach lacrosse though.
Well, right, yeah. So, but I play in my men's league, but I like have it ingrained. Like I have to go through this like warm up, this like dynamic warm up, and I do this series of kind of dynamic stretches and a couple little activation things, but just to like get loose, right?
Right.
I played with this guy who was probably the best athlete on our team by far, like All-American, like just, stud, and he never stretched, like ever. And and what he would say, he was like, I stretched once and I got hurt.
Oh my gosh.
And so he never did it. But so that's kind of interesting, to see too, is like for me, it feels like it's almost necessary. Like if I don't do it, then I don't feel like as fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And then for somebody like him, where he's like, if I do it, then it's like I'm too loose or so, So it's like this weird balance. Now, granted, again, body types completely different. This dude is like 6'4", very lanky. I'm not that size person, right? So that's where you kind of get this variation, right, between people. So it's like, we keep coming back to this, but it's like it's so much more of an individual approach to things with a lot of this stuff than there is to say that there's like a one size fits all type.
Right.
Of
Yeah, like
thing.
the guy with super tight hamstrings, maybe that guy needs to stretch and do mobility
Probably.
exercises before doing his sport. But if you're just like this lanky guy who is already flexible, then maybe you do nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I did, again, just kind of doing some research prior to this. I did come across another paper that I thought was interesting, and this is from our good buddy Phil Page.
Ah.
And so shout out to Phil. This is from a while. This was 12 years ago. He wrote this paper.
You're going to make Phil feel so old.
He's been doing this for a long time.
Really long time.
Yeah. But it was current concepts in muscle stretching for exercise and rehabilitation. So very, apt for our discussion here. But I thought one of the interesting points that he had mentioned was, let's see if I can find it here. So stretching, he says, stretching performed as a part of a warm-up prior to exercise is thought to reduce passive stiffness and increase range of movement during exercise. But this was the point. In general, it appears that static stretching is most beneficial for athletes requiring flexibility for their sports. So gymnastics, dance, things that you need to be able to, kick your leg up above your head kind of a thing, right? Whereas dynamic stretching may be better suited for athletes requiring running or jumping performance during their sport, like basketball players, sprinters, and so on.
This power generation.
Exactly, yeah. So it's like you need to sort of, like you said, you want to feel that muscle. You want to know that you can create that connection between your mind and your body, but you want it to be solid. You don't want it to be this kind of like, overly loose type of interaction. So I thought that was interesting. So yeah, shout out Phil for doing the hard work.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess another one where the answer is it depends.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have a common theme with these myths here today. And so we'll see. We'll see as we go down the list if we keep finding that.
So moving on to our next topic, we have the truth about strength training. So, one of the little bullet points for this topic was, how does biomechanics challenge the old school versus new school debate?
Okay.
Honestly, I struggled with what does old school versus new school mean.
Yeah.
Were you able to find out?
Not particularly. I mean, I think old school maybe is like, you think back to kind of the early days of strength training in general, right? Where it's just like certain amount of reps, heavy weight, like that's sort of what you're always going for is just this like, can you move this object that's heavier every single time? Whereas maybe new school is maybe more of this like functional training. You look at guys like LeBron James, for instance, right? And like, he famously pays his trainer whatever, some ungodly amount of money, millions of dollars, to ensure that for him, being 41 years old, that he's, still competing at the top of his game, right? And you look at some of the training that he's doing, strength training that he's doing, and it's totally unconventional in terms of like, he's doing like all these different sort of mobility things, a lot of band work, a lot of sort of dual task stuff where he's balancing and he's having to, do some sort of strength training. So maybe that's like new school compared to old school, just as like strict, hey, here's this one exercise, do it to this many reps, then do this next. I don't know. This is an area that I feel like is just ripe for controversy, to be honest.
Yes, 100%. My first inclination is essentially the same as yours, looking into it. But I also found that like in relation to bodybuilding, which is subset of strength training, I guess, like old school was the bigger the better, and new school is more like this functional, like better aesthetic sort of thing, or maybe it was opposite. It doesn't make that much sense to me to be opposite. But I don't know. So in general, I mean, maybe going off of that, right? Like strength training used to be thought of as this very like doing these heavy lifts, like if you lift heavy, you'll get strong, which is still true.
Yeah.
but it's not
Yeah,
the
at the
full
end of the day,
story.
that's kind of the benchmark, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if your only exercises are squats, deadlifts, and bench press, I mean, those are the main lifts for a power lifter.
Mhm.
Those guys are strong as heck,
Yeah.
right? But what about your unilateral exercises?
Sure.
What about balance?
Right.
What about those crazy exercises where you have that like the barbell with the weights hanging off of them on bands and you're standing on like, have you seen those? It's crazy.
Yeah, like they've got I can't imagine those setups probably take those guys, 20 minutes just to put together for
I know.
one
It seems
one
so
repetition,
inconvenient.
but they're getting something out of it.
Yeah. But kind of going into this, I did find a kind of cool article that talked about strength training as it relates to basically capacity for just like hip and knee biomechanics.
Okay.
So, can you alter someone's hip and knee biomechanics with strength training? And the test they used was a jump test.
Okay.
This was an article called "The Effects of Feedback with and Without Strength Training on Lower Extremity Biomechanics" by Herman et al. And essentially, the hypothesis was that lower extremity strength training would provide an increased capacity to alter hip and knee biomechanics. There were two groups. One underwent this 9-week strength training routine. The other group did nothing for 9 weeks. And they did a jump test to basically figure out, okay, can we alter these athletes' hip and knee biomechanics, or maybe they weren't athletes, maybe they were just people,
Sure.
during these jump tasks by having them do strength training as well. And I found this one interesting because this study didn't aim to just do one thing, right? It aimed to do strength training, but it also used video assisted feedback. And so it's kind of like, so just to tell you the answer so you're not on the edge of your seat.
Yeah.
Basically, the results indicated that strength training, when used in conjunction with video-assisted feedback, may provide an increased capacity for the alteration of knee and hip biomechanics. So just better mechanics during these jump tasks. But to me, I'm reading this article, I'm going like, okay, well, what if we separated those two, though? Like, what about the strength training without the feedback and the coaching?
Sure, yeah.
What about the feedback and the coaching without the strength training?
So that's what it was. It was video feedback and strength training, or nothing.
Yes.
Okay. So they didn't have that separation. Yeah, I would be curious to know like which one actually of those provided the greater impact.
Yeah. So I felt that was really interesting, but in general, I thought this was just an interesting example of, strength training, new school versus old school in general, because a lot of the time, I mean, people, when you thought of strength training back then, you're mainly thinking of these bodybuilders who are lifting just to lift. But now every athlete who's in the peak of their game does some kind of strength training and like does lift quite heavy. And it's like a very important part of how these athletes move.
Yeah, totally. I think, it seems like this debate about strength training in general and what's best, and it kind of is cyclical. It feels like where you sort of started with the basics of like, hey, heavy object, lift heavy object, right? And then that was again the benchmark for is somebody strong or not? Can they do that thing? Maybe after they do that so many times, now they get hurt, right? Because they just aren't thinking about the mechanics of how they're lifting the heavy object. They're just doing it, right? Whatever way they can, right? The path of least resistance that day or that rep, right? But eventually, maybe an injury happens, right? And we're sort of going through a journey here. And so then at that point, now you retrospectively look back and you say, okay, why did I get hurt? It was like, oh yeah, because I was like, I'm much more advantaged mechanically if I square up to this thing and try to lift it, using all these sort of power positions versus in this really awkward position that I overstrained myself and created an injury. So then you sort of put some barriers there, And then now it goes into this next stage of like, well, we can achieve, the same intensity of this exercise, but through, this variation. Like you don't have to lift this big heavy object anymore. You can now just target this particular muscle or functional set of muscles by doing, using this machine. And
Yeah.
then you're like, okay, cool. And so now you're sort of eliminating some of this possibility of injury because you're now using this kind of thing that was designed specifically for that.
But the other thing about those machines is, do they make you lazy and reduce the need to use these stabilizer muscles?
Right. So now you've over-targeted, right? So then you keep going down the line, and now another injury happens. And then you're like, oh, well, it happened because we weren't using, the whole body, right? Or like, you lost some of the stability, or you overtrained this particular area, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
So now you just kind of like keep going in like this circle of decisions that go from this kind of like really basic lift heavy object to maybe something that's like hyper designed to do something. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the right answer is somewhere in the middle between all of those, but it seems like the industry tends to kind of follow that pathway, going back round and around and around.
It feels like
in
there's a
search
lot
of this like
controversy and arguing around these different groups of people that believe certain things about strength training too.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think it comes back to like, what's the goal? Like, what are you trying to do? Like, you take a bodybuilder, and their goal is to build their body. Like, they want to aesthetically look like, this perfect specimen of a person, to where you can look and you can see every single muscle, and they're able to control those muscles like individually, right? So they have this really, really in-depth, tuning between their mind and their body. And so their targets in the gym are to be able to hyper focus, hyper target, this particular muscle group at this time, so I can get it bigger, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they probably, very many of them are also functionally strong too, but that isn't to say that they're the same level of functional strength as like a LeBron James or something like that.
Yeah.
But his goal is to be able to slam dunk a basketball, over a guy who's 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
And all the other components that have to go along with being a high level athlete like that. So for him, it's like this combination of strength, mobility, endurance, right? He has all these other facets that he has to build into his profile. And so
this guy's whole life is his sport. So he has all day to put all of the nutrition and mobility routines and strength training and recovery into that.
Right. Yeah, that's, I mean, that's the dream, right? Just be able to work out for a living.
I know,
right? But in any case, it again is like very individualized to the person and what they're targeting, I think. And so it's funny, it's tough to say that there's like a way to even debunk this as a myth, because I think it really just depends on like, what are you trying to accomplish? Like, it's the old school weightlifting is incredibly valuable for a power lifter.
Yeah.
And then this functional style of weightlifting or training or whatever might be more beneficial for, a basketball player or whoever.
Yeah.
And then, your regular everyday person, I think, sort of in the middle to an extent. I mean, like, you want to be functionally strong and you want to know these like power positions, but you also want to be able to just move your body, right? You're not trying to be ultra stiff. Like, some of the power lifters are, right? It's like they can lift as so much weight in this like sagittal extension plane, but you ask them to go and twist around or do like a lateral shuffle, and it gets a little dicey.
It gets a little dicey there. Yeah. I think what's really important about strength training, as someone who does strength training, is just learning about the correct way to move.
Sure.
And kind of going back to the first thing we talked about, like, what is the proper running form?
Yeah.
There is no one proper form, right? It wasn't a research article, but it was an article that was just a blog post written by a researcher, Brett Contreras, about squatting.
Sure.
And about, okay, we have these two women with entirely different anthropometries. One of them has relatively longer femur length relative to the other.
Okay.
And the woman with long femurs couldn't squat very upright. She had to lean forward a lot. And the woman with relatively shorter femurs relative to her torso was able to squat more upright.
Okay.
Both are great squats, but they didn't look at all similar. One had much more hip flexion because you have to lean over a lot more when you have these long femur moments.
Interesting.
And one of them looked a lot more like this.
Yeah.
You know, this for the camera, out of that. But you know, just another aspect of, you know, there's no perfect form. Like there's a way, there are multiple ways to do something, but the important thing is just learning how to do something so that you can move well. Like I think learning to deadlift in general is super important because everyone picks stuff up off the ground and has to put it somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you have no idea how to lift with your legs, like that's,
well, I think
that can really contribute to injuries later on, even for people that like don't call themselves athletes.
Right. Yeah, and maybe that's really what is the sort of crux of all this is like it's about safety. It's not necessarily about like, you know, the goals or what you're going to achieve is, and what you choose to get there as far as your strength training program is going to be based off of those goals. But I think there's an agreement that there's always going to be like a safe or mechanically optimized way to accomplish that thing. And there may be variations, you know, as you just described, but like for instance, you know, in a deadlift, right? Like you're not going to just lean over with your legs completely stiff and just try and lift this weight all with your back, right? Because that's going to hurt your back.
Yeah.
And so, you know, but understanding kind of the mechanics of how do you link those different chains of your body to be able to lift this thing up appropriately. I mean, not only does that give you the ability to probably lift more, you have higher capacity once you sort of figure out that synchronization between all of those different muscle groups, and you have them in their like good optimized positions, but you're also going to do it without exposing yourself to too much of an injury risk.
Yeah.
Right. So that's maybe where this myth gets busted. Is it's not
you hear that?
Yeah, do you
busted.
hear that? Yeah, it's busted. Not that it's, you know, there's this difference in outcome between old school and new school, because I mean I think it's totally dependent on the person, but the myth is that, you know, is there a difference in the strength, in like how things have developed in strength training? And I think it comes back to like yeah, sort of, but at the end of the day, like
not
you're
really.
just trying, not really, and you're just trying to preserve risk pretty much. Like you just don't want people to get hurt, and so there are maybe more of these ideal positions for people to do some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, going back to those big lifts that powerlifters do, like squat, deadlifts, and bench, right? I mean, no one functionally changed the way that those things have been performed over the last 100 years. No one is like, I invented a better way to deadlift. Like, it just, that's where it hasn't changed, right? Like, biomechanically, there is a right way and a wrong way to do that with variation.
Yeah.
It's just that now I think there's a greater importance on, as you said, these accessory exercises for the stabilizer muscles and, you know, other aspects of functional movement tied into it.
I think one area that's still very controversial and probably a lot of debate still going on is maybe more with like volume. You know, are you doing high rep, low weight? Are you, or, you know, vice versa, lower rep, higher weight, you know, or are you periodizing your workouts, right? So like that sort of approach, now that's where you can really get into like the nitty gritty of things and see, okay, if you do one type of cycle versus another, do you get different results maybe faster or, whatever, right? So,
Right. And that we're not even just talking about like form and like how biomechanically do you do it anymore, right? We're talking about volume, we're talking about
exactly, yeah,
nutrition, we're talking about what supplements are you taking, like
sure, yeah,
how much are you like periodizing how much you eat every week with your training too. Like those are the things that, those guys at that level believe are important too. And I mean they are.
yeah,
I'm not saying it's a black. It's just there's a lot that goes into the strength training world, I guess,
sure.
too. I mean overall just being an athlete.
Yeah, one day we'll have to try and get, people in here to maybe educate us on,
Yeah.
the different versions. Um, they can debate it out themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've touched on strength training, we've touched on stretching, we've touched on running form. Um, seems like a lot of this is we're coming to the conclusions that there isn't necessarily an ideal. Um, much of the approaches that have to be taken in any of those are kind of dependent on the person, the goal, um, the situation, even maybe, I don't know, access. Like there's
Yeah,
so many
right.
different things. But I think this is an interesting next point to sort of round us out here is like, are there, in your opinion, and maybe you even found some research on this, but are there any exercises that are like magic bullets, that are the just go-to exercise if you want to have functional mobility, functional strength, power, all the things that everyone's looking for in terms of a training element. What do you think?
That's a big question.
That's it.
I
Yep.
I wasn't able to narrow it down quite so much. I
Okay.
couldn't figure out the best way to ask the internet, what is the best training program or
Yeah.
training routine or the best exercises. I did find um, several articles that compared the efficacy of different exercises relative to each other,
Okay.
relating to like the EMG activation.
Interesting.
So, for example, like just these basic exercises, right? There's this one article, and I'll have to probably take a second to look through it in my tabs here because I wrote down the the idea, but I didn't write down the name of the article. But it was an article that was comparing the EMG activity for a 1 rep maximum for squats, hip thrusts, and Romanian deadlifts.
Mm.
And so the basics of it were that there were no significant difference found between Romanian deadlifts and hip thrusts for a 1 rep maximum, but there was a difference between those two things in squats, which had relatively lower muscle activity. And so I thought this was an interesting, just like not specifically this article, but there are groups of articles that talk about similar stuff.
Yeah.
Like people argue about like which is the best exercise for glute growth,
Okay.
or like, whatever muscle, So I think that area is a really interesting one to be in because it kind of seems like that is testable, right?
Mhm.
There are exercises that are objectively better at activating different muscle groups.
Or all of the muscle groups.
Or all of the muscle groups. I found this one particularly interesting because we're talking about hip thrusts, which is primarily a hip extension exercise, versus a Romanian deadlift, which is where that glute activation is primarily in that flexed position, hip flexion.
Mm.
So it's kind of like, how do you compare those levels of EMG activity too? They're completely different.
Yeah.
It's like the stretch versus the shortening.
Well, I guess when you're doing a deadlift though, like you are extending.
You
right?
are
Yeah, so
extending
like
up, yeah.
that's the final position, right?
Exactly. But there's a lot more stretch in
Sure.
something like a deadlift and a squat versus a hip
Versus
thrust,
a-
which
yeah,
is all
totally.
the squeeze, not the stretch.
Exactly. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so you're getting kind of two sides of that coin versus just the one side.
Right.
Yeah, that's also an interesting point. I mean, sort of off topic slightly, but uh, you hear about some of these exercises that are starting to maybe more part of this like new school approach where you're doing like half um, range of motion. Like you're really hyper focusing on like just doing like the squeeze, right?
Right. Like these
Versus,
partial reps.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like is there, what is the benefit for that? And I think obviously the science is kind of still being fleshed out a little bit on that, but that'll be interesting to see how that becomes incorporated into kind of like popular exercise, let's say.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is like most people, take that setup that we were talking about where it's like, you got a barbell and you've got, a bunch of resistance bands and, they're hanging chains off the resistance bands. And like, that's just not like practical for somebody to go to the gym and set up,
No, but no one has that in their gym.
No. Well, and if you did, like people around you in the gym would be like, hey, man, I'm trying to use these, these
like,
chains.
why are you
Yeah,
using
exactly.
all of these things at once?
But so it's like that sort of new school exercise science to an extent is not really practical for people to do on a regular basis. It's really meant for these people that have access to that stuff.
Right.
And so it'll be interesting though to see like, is there a change in sort of the way that popular exercise is performed? Like does it get determined that okay, maybe going through full range of motion on certain reps of things is not actually as beneficial as just doing these shortened range of motion ones. I don't know.
I think the better answer though is why not just do both of those things?
Sure. Oh yeah, try it all.
Right? Like maybe there's not one thing. Like there are all these studies comparing like which exercise is better for this specifically, but all of those studies are talking about one thing, right?
Yeah.
Like in this case, and I did find this article, so I will give credit where credit is due. The article that I was talking about was called A Comparison Between Back Squat, Romanian Deadlift, and Barbell Hip Thrust for Leg and Muscle Activities During Hip Extension. And the authors are Jose Delgado and Eric Drinkwater, the primaries on that. But in general, just kind of going back to that conversation, like there are articles comparing exercises for these specific instances.
Mm-hmm.
But when we go back to practically, like, okay, I mean, maybe hip thrusts are better than squats at glute activation. Does that mean you shouldn't do squats for other reasons? Like, no,
right? Yeah.
Right? You still do all those things. Are these lengthened partials better than doing a full range of motion? Sometimes.
Yeah.
But like maybe like if you only did that, maybe you'd be losing out on some other, gains, whether it's like neuromuscular or like muscle growth that you would get from being able to do all of those things.
Right. So what you're saying is there isn't a magic bullet exercise.
That is what I'm saying.
Myth busted.
Myth busted.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, it's just kind of we're coming back to these same themes, and I think what's interesting is how biomechanics kind of plays a role in investigating a lot of this stuff. It doesn't necessarily inform one way or another in terms of like that this is better or this is worse. Sometimes it does, when you're asking the right question. But at the end of the day, like biomechanics is the only way to answer a lot of these questions, right? Like, you want to be able to look at how mechanics change based off of the conditions or the interventions that are being provided, right? So certain type of exercise, certain amount of weight, whatever it ends up being. And so, I think that's what's kind of cool about what we get exposed to is being able to see all this, the whole landscape of what people are sort of looking into when it comes to exercise science and sports science in particular, and just how dynamic it actually is. And I don't know, maybe one day we will find that magic bullet or something like that.
Maybe
there's definitely camps that think that there is one versus another, right? I mean, you got like kettlebell workouts, right?
Yeah.
Unilateral stuff, full range of motion, very functional type movement. Okay, maybe that's like the style of exercise that probably is the most beneficial for any normal type person, right? But is that going to be the best for a sprinter? I don't know, or a powerlifter, or basketball player, or whoever. So
yeah, I mean, specificity is really everything
Yeah.
here, right? Selection of whichever exercises you're picking is based on the specifics of
Yeah.
what the sport that athlete is doing.
Yeah. What I do know is that if somebody does figure out this, magic bullet exercise and then can create like a machine for it, they're going
Yeah.
to be a billionaire. So,
Yeah, totally.
that's the challenge out there, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I like exploring some of these myths. Maybe we'll have to come up with a few other ones to do in a future podcast. I think, probably also worth saying that if you have your own sports science myth out there, internet world, to contact us and tell us, because
Yep.
we'd be happy to investigate, see if we can figure it out, or just come back to the same conclusion that, hey,
Yeah.
it depends.
I was going to say, we'd be happy to chat about it for an hour and a half and then
Yeah.
come to the conclusion that there's no answer.
Yeah, but that's what we're here for. So,
Yeah.
Any last points?
No, I think I got it all out on my end.
Okay, good deal. Well, we will do it again here soon. So follow us on social media at NeurAxonUSA, and be on the lookout for the next episode.